This morning, maybe even a little bit past. Well, we're being gracious with the reality of the time change just a little bit. But it's just about time for us to begin. So if you'll find your spots, open your Bibles to the last major chunk of the text of Genesis. And by open, that means either slide, tap, flip open, or fold open as you prefer. But again, that's Genesis chapter 25 or so, all the way pretty much to the end of the book for this morning. We are continuing in our look at the history and geography of the biblical story. That means for this part of it, since we have laid the foundation of most of our initial map work, what we're doing is using the maps that we've self-created by careful attention to what's going on in the story, and then now we're going back and we're looking at the big arch of each of these biblical narratives and trying to make sure we pay attention to where they happen. And so we'll use the map as a tool in our study. A couple more times in the course of the next few months, we'll certainly get out a new fresh map and re-accomplish some of those same tasks of paying attention to the geographical aspects of it, and then locating some of the additional sites and cities that are more relevant to those stories. But right now, if you would, let's bow in prayer, and then after that prayer, we'll get into the three major stories that takes place in these 25 chapters. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the time that we share in study and reflection on the Scriptures. It's our hope as we pay attention to your word that you are able to grant us wisdom and insight as we seek to understand the history of your work with mankind. Help us to be considerate to one another, to be encouraging, and to share the gospel in clarity and confidence as we talk to those who are seeking Christ. Please forgive us of our sins, and we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All righty, so again, we are here in the text of Genesis, and we are going to be kind of paying attention specifically and incrementally to those interactions between the story that is familiar and the land that may not be as familiar. And so we're linking those pieces together. There are three main individuals we'll pay attention to in these 25 verses. That's Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. They form the framework of this story. And I wanted to point something out that I think is a useful tool in remembering these stories. If you remember, let me tie that together, when we were going through the book of Acts last year, the way in which Luke, by both inspiration and perspiration, advances the story forward is he introduces to us somebody new. And so that person who's new becomes the next step in the story. An example of that is to think about Stephen, as he is shown to us as one of the initial servants selected. And then the next part of the story is Stephen, who we just met. We get a little backstory of, becomes the next story in the sharing of the gospel. But that also then sparks the next introduction, which is Saul, who we also know has the Greek context name of Paul, and so on. So that new person slowly advances the story in a very logical way. Well, that's what's going on in this Old Testament context as well, that as we introduce these new patriarchs, we kind of link them all with that big basket name, they're really just being shown to us in a essentially sequential order of this person will become important to the story going forward. And let me clarify that term patriarch. Sometimes we think it's like a super hyper official term. All that is trying to give a basket name to a bunch of other names. And so when we talk about in regards to the Old Testament text, we use patriarchs because that's an old school name for it. But really it's probably as easily understood if we had just used last names, if those were being employed. So if we were going to talk about our own histories, we might use last names to describe that family unit, or you might have used kind of family units names. Well, these are the so-and-sos, and then these are the so-and-sos. And that's all that is. That patriarchal term has little to do with much beyond that this is just a basketing of each of those families. Because God then works individually through not only those patriarchal baskets, but often there are outliers that come in to shift our perspective or are folded in to these events and these settings and these people. But this is our structure, which are these three key individuals right now, which again is Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. All right, so with that, and with those three individuals kind of tied together for us here, we're zeroing in now into, for this time frame, what is more properly referred to as Canaan. Again, for remembrance and for kind of making sure these ideas stick, what are two other names for this area that we've suggested?
Promised land.
Promised land. That one appears most often actually in what part of our assembled worship? Let me give you a super abundant hint as to what I'm suggesting. Yeah, in our songs, right? In our hymns and spiritual songs, a lot of the hymns from the 1800s that we still use. Remember, our hymnals are actually the best of from about every 10 or 20 years. Only the best songs tend to survive past that 10 or 20 year introduction phase. And so Promised Land gets used a lot in our hymnals. And if you pay attention to the way that a lot of them refer to that area, that picture Promised Land initially is talking about this area, but then it gets co-opted into looking heavenward and forward. So that's one of them, Promised Land. What's another one? You read about it in the news, but it's the wrong context for it. Palestine, right? And Palestine, as used today in the 21st century, is not talking about the same concepts, even though it's the same word that's been stretched forward. Palestine, as used in the Roman world, which is prior to our existence, but after our events here, is pulled from some of the island chains near it and kind of stretched over this whole region by the Romans. And so they referred to it as Palestine. So we also refer it to as Palestine when we're talking about it. Predominantly during the time of Christ, it gets referred to in that area as the whole region and the whole area in that regard. So right here, though, we've got our centralized map of Canaan. It's going to focus in heavily on Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And there's going to be some gradual shifting of the individuals and the families that are around here. Key reminders. In this section, especially in this region right around the Dead Sea, from Jericho down to Zoar, that's an area that is very desolate, hard to exist in. It's not just about the fact that there are no agricultural land for the most part, but it's also rocky on the eastern side of this Dead Sea space. On the western side, it's a sloped area that is really only fed by the carved streams, or what you'll see most often in your atlases of the Bible lands, wadis. That's W-A-D-I. Those are streams that really only flow, for the most part, when there is abundant rains. They're all rain-fed except for a very few. One of the most notable we'll encounter later when we're talking about David and Saul. It's slightly north on your maps of modern maps of Megiddo area and some of the fortressing that's right there is a spring-fed wadi. And so it runs year-round, but the amount of water that's in it is very minimal until the rains come. It's a small stream, but it actually is central to the dialogues that take place from David and Saul when they are at odds with one another toward the end of Saul's reign. All right, so some of the things that happen in our text, starting in chapter 25, as Isaac is going to move west to Gerar because of a famine. Pretty common context for biblical narratives. How many famines are we aware of, at least now that we have this one off the top of our heads, that drive people around? There's one that comes much later in the story of God's people that they get foreknowledge of. So you got this one, and there's two prophesied famines that are major ones. One's involving this guy who's on our list up there, Joseph, right? And what's the context for Joseph's involvement with the famine? We'll see it again in a little bit, but let's talk about it right now too. Who tells Joseph about the famine that's coming, and how does that work?
The dream.
He says it's a dream. He says, I've had a dream. There's a dream that I've had, and there's a dream that the ruler, the Pharaoh, or the king has had. And Joseph declares, I can interpret these in this way, and I know just what we need to do. And so we'll talk about that when we get to Joseph. What's the other one, though? It's in the book of Acts. Remember, it involves the disciples who are going to send out from Jerusalem funds to help those in the outside region of Jerusalem, all the way up into Turkey, because there's going to be no food. There's going to be war and trouble. And so they send their funds out from Jerusalem, and then it flips around when the war comes in, and everyone that was in there that supported in the future, well, they are now receiving all those people that they once sent money to. And so just really good, quick, important to kind of catch those details. Isaac is going to continue to prosper, though. He moves to Rehoboth because the men of Gerar grew jealous of him. And so that's kind of the shortened form of the event. At Beersheba, Abimelech comes and makes a treaty with Isaac. He also made a treaty there with Abraham some years earlier. Beersheba, way to think about this, to tie it to your memories. It's a term, Beersheba, indicates many wells. So this area where these treaties are taking place are all well treaties, water right treaties. I want you to think about your own personal experiences. How important are water rights in the lands that your parents, grandparents, and families owned? Even now, right? We still kind of see water rights being issues in large communities. Up north in Tennessee, they're now trying to figure out how to get more water into the middle part of the state for its growing population base. And they're trying to figure that one out. That's nothing new. So these treaties, and nearly most of the treaties that are family unit treaties, not nation-to-nation treaties, in this part of the history of Israel, are all about who gets the rights to the water. They don't care so much about the boundaries of dirt because most of the dirt isn't useful. But what's really useful is water. And like when we talk about Masada later, we'll talk about how water was even brought up to the top of some of the fortresses, because Masada is a great illustration of fortresses from antiquity and why water was so important, as well as some of the other sites that we'll see and talk about. So we've got now the family going forward. Twin brothers are born. How great is the relationship between these brothers?
Not good.
Short answer is always not good, right? And when did it start being not good?
From the beginning.
Yeah, so the text talks about them and actually describes this relationship in tones that are prophetic, right? As well, this is going to be a thing going forward. We need to be careful, though, as we think about it, because sometimes we extend the prophetic immediate context of that relationship past Israel, and we lay it permanently at the shoulder of the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob. And the Bible text isn't necessarily so conclusive that says that's going to be for all time, for everywhere. And there's always going to be conflict, because here's the thing. How many times have people been at conflict simply because they're people and live next to each other? Like all the time. And, if you really want to get bored, look up in your local communities over where you've lived over the years and talk about, I want to see conflict about property lines. And we're talking about usually like 6 inches to 12 feet as the range where people get upset about property lines. You built your fence on my land. Well, you just gave me a fence is what that actually ends up meaning. But in the short run, we fight about it. We fuss about things like that. So in that space, you've got some of the things that become functional stories that are retold to teach a truth. We still do that. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever taken the story of Esau in that soup, pottage, porridge, whatever you want to use as the various ways to kind of translate that word, to describe a 21st century circumstance? Well, you just sold out your 4A, right? Whatever. We use the framework of that story to describe a thing. The Bible does that a couple times too. It's not like we're the only ones taking a historical event and turning it into a moralization. The Bible does it too. That's often a good thing. But here we have a kind of reminder, hey, look, you sold out something really important to you for something that was just for right now. You didn't think this through. That story becomes emblematic of many humans from this point forward. And you can probably look inwardly and say, hey, that's actually me at times. But when we bring it back to the dirt, to the land, you think about the context of things that matter. So if all of the treaties in the area had been water right treaties for the most part, and here we have Esau, whose biggest skill is that he's a hunter and he can go out and get meat. And he's good at getting meat and stuff like that. He has a rare skill that makes it a little bit different. But in the sense of his family and the nation, his skill doesn't actually provide for them in the ways that someone who can negotiate a treaty does. So his value is emotional rather than strategic in that relational space. Here's one more step or two steps forward. When Israel is leaving Egypt, what's their complaints? Where do they go? I wish we had the pots, the big meat pots that they would cook for us in Egypt, because all we got here is manna. It's only what God provides in abundance. We would have had those meat pots. They're basically doing, if you think about the way that this literature plays out, an expanded version of what took place just in their past. Throwing out their future of greater value and their birthright because they wanted to go back and get something that wasn't that important. So we have that kind of laid out for us. And then they have a way in which their relationship gets further and further apart from one another. So it starts off not great. It never is great. But are they the only ones making this relationship difficult? Yeah, so inside the story of this messy family unit, who also is helping make it not good? Parents aren't helping. What's the specific thing that seems to be taking place? Favoritism. Most parents I know try really hard to balance things out. But also, most people I know always want to know who the favorite is. That's like who's a favorite. I'll use my own parents' family, my dad's family in particular. They have 4 boys. And uniformly, if you ask 3 and sometimes all 4 boys, who Mama's favorite was, it was Jimmy. It was James, who was the youngest one. He was the favorite of the 4. The 3 older brothers absolutely believed it. The youngest one determined to never deny it. He's like, I don't lose anything by denying this, so that's how it was. And actually, it did create some difficulty. Even though, in reality, my grandparents, in their era, it wasn't like they could favor anybody of substance anyway, because of the economics of their situation. There was no extra blessings to offer out. Everyone got exactly the same, and all clothes flowed downhill. And so the oldest got it first, and the youngest got it last, and that's just how it was. So in that context, this is something we can relate to, right? And if you're not aware of it, then the problem festers. In this case, they were obviously aware of it, and they didn't seem to care. It even produced outcomes for the second generation that seemed to mimic their home life when you think about Joseph, who also became a favored child in his family. And as their circumstances grow and their marital connections expand, this relationship then moves forward, and we now focus in on Jacob as our next big chunk of individuals to kind of think through. And he's gone and determined to build his family. So how does his marital situation play out in short order? You guys remember how the whole courtship goes on for Jacob?
More deception.
Yeah, there's some dishonesty going on, and it's bi-directional, right? We think about Jacob, he's not necessarily 100% clear in his relationships either, but his father-in-law isn't being plain and clear either. There's a lot of problematic corners to this relationship that will eventually work out. And with that, the family unit, as described in the scriptures, creates additional conflict. Because we have not only two first-order wives, but the Bible uses a variety of terminologies, and Antiquity adds a couple more to talk about second-status wives. Those second-status wives had a variety of relational things that may not be familiar to us. The primary one in these additional marriages that the Bible shows to us is rights of inheritance. So the primary distinguishing factor between our culture and what we're familiar with and what was taking place at this time is who inherits what. There doesn't seem much positive or negative instruction regarding can you do so. The context at this point in the story of God's people is who inherits, who gets the rights. And that was often variable based on the disposition of the patriarch, the male head of the family. And so these second-tier wives, they didn't know what their offspring were going to receive. They may have had an equal status relationally, but their offspring may have been promised nothing in their inheritance. And if you think back and you go to Abraham, that was one of the complaints that was laid at his feet regarding his offspring from a second order or second layer relationship spouse. Hey, look, my kids are not going to have anything. This child's going to have nothing. And she sought God, and God promised and cared for her that she would be in her ascendancy taken care of. And so Jacob's context then creates a more convoluted family stream, if you will. Because we end up with how many offspring from Jacob? 12, right? But we all know who the favorite was, right? Who is identified for us as the favored child of the father?
Joseph and Benjamin.
Yeah, Joseph and Benjamin, for whatever reason, are seem to have really kind of cream of the crop. Joseph in particular is given indication of being favored. Because what does he get as a gift? We'll talk about this a couple times in the future as well. Oh, he gets a fancy coat. Fancy coat. Coat of many colors, right? Something to think about. It's not actually about the value of the coat. Because think about it, this coat is given to him as if it was a robe. And what kind of things had he been saying to his brothers? What's his play? He says he's interpreting dreams, right? And later down the road, he says that again. It's kind of his mode of operation in many ways. But what were his brothers going to do?
He was going to rule over them.
Yeah, he's going to rule over them. His daddy gave him a robe. They're going to bow down to him. Now, this is independent of whether it all comes out to happen. But I want you to picture for a moment that you are one of the brothers. You're one of the older brothers. And your little pipsqueak brother, because that's how it's going to feel, comes up to you and says, you know what? You're going to bow down to me. I'm going to rule over you. How are you going to feel about that? Emotionally and naturally as a big sibling. Ain't no way, no how. Especially when they're at the age, and the age is indeterminate in some of these stories to a certain degree, where you feel like you could just go over there, grab them by the ankle, and hold them for a while. Right? Say that again. Tell me you're going to rule over me and I'm going to bow down to you when I can hold you up like this. That's a relational feeling. And it also helps us determine and describe how their relationship goes. Their relationship isn't great. And we won't see this textual detail, but I want to throw this in here. When Joseph is sent out to check on his brothers, he is established in the text by the wordplay that is there, that he is known to be a snitch and to embellish the story. The words that are used about Joseph is that he's going to come back and give a report about his brothers, but it's the way it's worded, he's not going to give just the facts. Oh yes, they were out in the field doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're good. It's going to be, you want to know what they're up to? They're not doing what they were told to do. So there's some classic kind of relational things in this story. And most of them are actually there because of the way in which Jacob, Rebekah, and beyond, Leah and etc., have staged this combative relationship. A relationship that really seemed to focus on power more than love, and holding that power above all else. So as the story unfolds and Jacob is continuing his journey, he's going to the Jordan, the gods are going to meet, or God in particular that is going to send a messenger to meet with him, most likely at our location that's south of Gilead here. If you remember our rivers on the east side of the Jordan that are our Y jazz as we're kind of laying them down. We've got our Jabbok river here. It kind of shows us approximately this location. Now remember, this is not a populous region. This is an empty space. It's a place where you don't stay. But it does show us approximately where we kind of think this is taking place. In this context, rightfully so, Jacob holds to a concern that his brother wants to kill him. And you think about how that played out. He's taken from him layer upon layer of blessings. And even though eventually that will fit in with the plans that God has and will lay out for him, this is theft. What would we call that today, based on this encounter, if we kind of roll back to Jacob and Esau? We got a fancy term for what he does here. This is identity theft. Because how does he pretend to be his brother? What's his method? He gets himself feeling like his brother. Oh, he's fuzzy. He's furry. He's got lots of hair. So I'm going to fake that. I'm going to fake it by bringing him a meal just like his. That's how identity theft works. They find the key indicators of who you are, and they offer it up to the person who is checking it. Your birth date, your social security number, or a different number, your child's favorite toy when they were 7, whatever it is, the standard questions that they ask you to verify. And they present it and say, here I am, this is me. Here I am, I'm Esau. I brought you this. Here I am. I'm Bobby Williams. You look at me like, that's definitely not true, right? But if I had the desire of Esau and the desire of Jacob for power or for immediacy, you start having that relationship, and Jacob goes, well, I can pretend to be Bobby. All I got to do is figure out what that special thing is. So that illicit activity then creates a high level of animosity between them, very obviously. They feel like they want to kill each other. They don't actually come to blows per se, but they certainly behave like they're going to. They will then start establishing themselves as communities around their power. Jacob settles for a while in the city that's called Succoth, and later he will cross the Jordan and will buy land in a region and a place that's called Shechem. That will become important to Israel a couple of times down the road. At Shechem, though, Jacob's daughter is mistreated by a person from there, a man from there, and two of his sons independently determined to take revenge, and they just lay waste to the city, to the village that's there. Now, that's not really great behavior for your neighbors, right? On the one hand, you could empathize with them and go, hey, this should not be happening. There needs to be justice for our family member. But they went past justice into retribution. And they did so without consulting the rest of their community, who are going to have to deal with the consequences of their behavior. Because now, human behavior and experience, and just like their actions foretold, everyone else is going to hate them. They don't care if they were justified or not, because these are dangerous people living right next to us, who are powerful and are growing in number. And from Shechem, Jacob is going to move his family to Bethel. You're going to see those two places become notable going forward. Note also that your Bible, depending on your translation, is going to include maybe some extra notes about calling this place Bethel. It's important to note that as all places in these areas, their names change over the years. And so Bethel becomes the standardized name for the spot a little bit later than these events. But Bethel itself will then be also centralized for Israel as the place at which there's a conflict between Shechem and Bethel regarding where to worship, when the tabernacle is still the center of Israel's worship. After leaving Bethel and heading south, his wife Rachel will die during her birth of Benjamin, which will become one of the key focal points for Jacob, even all the way forward into the narrative of Joseph that will take place. Jacob will join his father, Isaac, at Hebron. Jacob's favorite child at this point was the next to the youngest, Joseph. It's the oldest son of Rachel. He's identified as being, in some ways, a righteous person. Then he gets sent out to see what's going on with everything. And he thinks that they're at Shechem, but they find them at Dothan. Brothers who have this acrimonious relationship with Joseph, how are they talking about their brother in this process? How are the...
Dreamer of dreams.
You dreamer of dreams. And what's their literal thought process? What are some of them suggesting? We're going to kill him. You think about that for a second. We're going to kill our own brother because of this problem that is unresolved. And his oldest brother, who's in this part of this, in part of everything else that's going on, they come up with an alternative plan, right? We're not going to kill him. We're getting him in this pit. And we're going to convince Dad that he's dead. Because if he's gone, problem's gone, right? No longer will he be the favorite, and one of us will be the favorite. And they'll just sell him into slavery. Eventually, that slides our story forward because we're going to see Joseph become the individual who tells the next part of the story, right? So with Joseph, what's his first stop as a servant slash slave? Because he kind of fills both roles at different points in this. Eventually his slavery context shifts to servant in the Pharaoh's house. But in this first house, what does he end up accomplishing there when he's working for Potiphar?
He showed his faithfulness to God.
Yeah, he ends up being identified for us here as being the chief steward of the household. And in the dialogue that takes place between he and Potiphar's wife, it's set up this way. That he is now over everything in the household. Even though we're not given the dialogue behind this, Joseph's perspective is well recognized in saying, look, I got control over everything of the master's house except one thing. And what's that one thing? His wife. Now, she, on the other hand, is trying to get him to break that barrier. We don't actually know all of her reasoning behind it because the text doesn't tell us. There's some level of indication of attraction. We could also reason any number of other options in there. But the bottom line is that relationship that she desired, he determined is not going to happen. And his solution to it is wildly simple, right? What's he do?
Run from it.
He literally ran away. Now, she caught a bit of his clothing that will eventually become a problem later. But just like, now catch it, Esau and his mess of soup, pottage, porridge, different words work the same way. Do we now also use this event from Joseph's life to try to teach ourselves something too? Yeah, it actually appears in the New Testament and in the Old Testament a couple of times regarding, hey, flee fornication. We use this the same way. We take it, we centralize its morality on that one thing, and we make an appropriate application. But remember, there's more going on here than just that. We're in the context of communities that are concerned about inheritance, concerned about a different kind of wealth, and that wealth is often seen in size of family and power in that regard. And we also don't know how much Joseph has shared with people about his past and his future at this point. Now let's add one more corner. Let's say I'm Joseph. I've got my past history of wearing the coat of many colors, and I believe that 100% one day in the future, my brothers will all bow down to me. They will all honor me as their Lord. And in the middle of that, I am tossed in a pit and thrown as a slave and sold. And now, as a slave, I somehow manage, without the robe, to rise to the second spot in the household in a very short amount of time. Trusted enough that the whole household is under his care. All right? And based on his behavior, you can kind of see he's going upward. He's an upwardly mobile guy who also has the potential of one day ruling over his brothers, another big family. That also creates our ability to think about, hey, what's going on there? Is this also driving the human side of these things? The Bible actually shows that that's Joseph's cycle. He starts at the bottom, rapidly rises to the top, and we learn later because God is using him to rescue more than him. Independent of his morality or his faithfulness, he is shown to be the anchor upon which this whole story will shift. With that, then, we think forward a little bit, and we see him eventually positioned in Goshen, which is another name for the area that we would identify as Egypt. It becomes central to the story a little later. It's an area that is incredibly fertile. It's not like Canaan at all. Even looking at the dirt, you can tell the difference. The dirt and the soil in this delta area of the Nile River is dark, rich, and incredibly fertile. And basically anything you plant there, it's going to grow. And we shipped over there from America in an agreement at some point, a variety of cotton plants. And it's one of the big reasons why there's a cotton industry in Egypt. And it's super fertile, it grows really well, and they're good at it. And so they have really profited from that. Well, in the context of our biblical story, now they're moved to an area through Joseph serving as the linchpin, as creating this incubator for Israel as a people. As that story unfolds and all of the complexities of it, including the touch and go kind of, Joseph seems to either be punishing or testing his brothers as they come out to him. He's definitely punishing them. Like the behavior that he's engaging there isn't kind, but it also comes off as a test as well to see, hey, are they going to try to get to me? And they don't even know who he is. You think about that for a second, that he's been away from them so long that they can't recognize him underneath the attire and garb of the Egyptian ruler that he has become. He's married into Egyptian families. He is now certainly fluent in the culture of the Egyptian empire, so much so that his own siblings who knew him when he was little and the ones who tossed him into the pit can't figure out who he is. They can't recognize him. He has to reveal himself to them. Lots of reasons that would make literal sense, but the Bible just lays it out for us. They don't know. With that, we then get the eventual reconciliation of the family that takes place in this area here. So we've migrated, more than 1,000 miles from the Canaan space down to Goshen, Egypt, Mizraim, the area that's going to become central in the relationships for Israel going forward. And we're going to see that this is also where Jacob himself will live and then pass away. But he's given permission to carry his father's body back to Canaan. That's a no small feat, if you will, to engage in that. Joseph is going to live 66 years after the famine that is central to the story. And he is going to also desire to be buried with his father in the promised land. This also becomes a big part of the story as this all begins to circle itself out. And time, because my clock says it's 15 after. So we'll stop right here. We'll have to pick up again next Sunday morning as we continue to walk through the story and make its connections to the land. Thank you, everyone, for your participation this morning, and I'm looking forward to next week as well.